Soldiers return from war with more than scars. Some bring back stories of things that don't fit easily into maps, reports, or intelligence briefings. Small, fast shapes at the edge of a flashlight beam, sounds that click and tap like talons on mud brick, creatures that vanish into sand as if the earth inhales them. These aren't ghost stories told around a fire to pass the time. They come from people who spent nights on roofs, spent months watching wire and doorways, who trusted their instincts because lives depended on them. They are eyewitness accounts of strange creatures that soldiers encountered in combat zones. Before we get deeper into individual accounts, a quick word from our sponsor. If the long nights, replaying memories, or the weight of things you've seen are making it hard to sleep, BetterHelp can connect you with licensed therapists online. We'll leave a link in the description. If this kind of deep, distrustful curiosity is your thing, hit subscribe. There's more like this every week, and your support helps keep the research going. At its most basic, these stories are anchored in ordinary military life. A foreign courtyard, a mud-walled compound, the dull thud of helicopter rotors, the high, thin whistle of desert wind. Forces on foot operate in a rhythm. Briefings, patrols, static guard duty through the long, low hours before dawn. Interpreters, local fixers and villagers are woven into that rhythm, their knowledge and fear often guiding where troops move and where they do not. Sleep deprivation, the constant threat of IEDs, and the adrenaline of a shoot-or-don't moment sharpen senses in strange ways. They also narrow the field of what can be noticed and how it's explained. And yet, across different deployments and different nationalities, a pattern recurs. Reports of something small and quick, sometimes described as humanoid, that moves with an agility unlike a typical animal. They are seen near guard posts in abandoned villages at the edges of trenches. They make noises, clicking, tapping, sometimes a high-pitched murmur. They are sometimes blamed for small bites or punctures on a soldier's feet. Local people often have names for them. Interpreters sometimes refuse to enter places where they're said to lurk. That repeating pattern is why these accounts are worth listening to, not because they prove a single impossible explanation, but because multiple independent witnesses describe similar impressions in similar settings. Below, I'll lay out several first-hand reports, each with context, sensory detail, and the reaction of witnesses. I'll not pretend to prove anything. I'll offer possibilities and point to patterns. For now, place yourself at a guard post under a wide sky and consider what a small sound at 2 in the morning can become. Nunatta, Helmand Province, 2010-2011. The first account I want to trace comes from a handle called Nunatta, attributed to a U.S. Army soldier deployed in Helmand Province around 2010-2011. The details are the kind of small tactical things that, in other contexts, make a story feel more credible. The post was high, a makeshift platform above a mud compound wrapped in concertina wire. His binoculars were on a strap, his thermal sight mounted because the unit expected small nocturnal animals and sometimes insurgent scouts. It was between 2 and 4 a.m., the hours when the desert's cold cuts through the layers you've piled on. He noticed a sound, like talons, he said later, clicking against the rough top of a mud wall. Not the soft pad of a fox or the jitter of stray dogs. This had a deliberate metallic rhythm. He moved his night optics onto the wall and saw in the grainy thermal feed nothing substantial, sometimes a hint of heat, a bright smudge that could have been a rat, could have been nothing. Then something leapt. It landed on the roof directly above him. Stomped, he said, like a man. And for a moment he felt that total, old kind of fear that has to do with being watched by something close enough to touch. He climbed up to the parapet and swept the dark with his weapon. The thermal showed no human-sized signature. The stomping faded. Whatever had made the sound had bounded off the far edge of the compound and was gone into the night. He described the shape as small and nimble, not taller than knee-height when it stood. The auditory memory stuck with him more than the visual, that clicking, that short, percussive stomp. He told the story with a flat, almost embarrassed tone. Soldiers often laugh off the things that unsettle them. But his voice hardened when he mentioned that later, the unit's interpreters would hiss a warning about things in that sector and refuse to go into certain buildings. What's important about this vignette isn't just the noise or the stomp. It's the convergence of sensory cues that resist a tidy explanation, Thermal optics failed to show a clear signature. A human-sized intruder would have registered. A small animal would likely make different sounds. The soldier stayed alert. He wasn't alone long enough to lapse into a vivid fantasy. He filed patrol reports that read like official logs for weeks after. For him, that moment on the parapet became an image he could not shake. 40 Commando Sangan, Royal Marines, and the village. They wouldn't enter. A different set of witnesses comes from a UK perspective. Royal Marines operating around Sangan. The key figure here is not a single Marine, but the interpreters who worked with them, the men who, time and again, refused to enter a particular village. These interpreters were seasoned. They had risked social ostracism and military danger to work with coalition forces. For them to call a place off limits, and to do so out of fear of little men, is not a trivial refusal. In their telling, the creatures were short, quick and aggressive in an unusual way. Locals described them as angry, small but with an animus that made people avoid the area. One interpreter, a man who had walked with British units under fire and negotiated releases after IED strikes, described an encounter in which he would not cross the threshold of a home because the air felt wrong, as he put it. He shied away from a courtyard where stones had been stacked in small heaps, and where footprints seemed too narrow for an adult man. To the Marines, there was an operational oddity. Villagers would sometimes place offerings on thresholds or tie cloths to a walking stick, small ritual acts to keep something unseen at bay. Western troops, coming from a different cultural frame, saw folk superstition. The interpreters saw reference points that mapped onto a set of beliefs about non-human agents. Put another way, when a soldier sees an empty courtyard, he might see tactical risk or nothing at all. When an interpreter looks at that same courtyard and remembers stories his grandmother told, the same space accumulates a different kind of threat. That interpretive gap between what a technologically equipped military eye notices and what a culturally embedded civilian sees appears in many of these accounts. Which is to say, local fear is not mere background color. It alters how spaces are used and reported, and sometimes it becomes an operational constraint. Thulu Clay, the village with wrong angles. Not all reports come from the post or the patrol. One handle, Cthulhu Clay, described an abandoned village that felt physically wrong. This was not a romanticized ghost town. It had odd architecture, windows low enough to the ground that an adult would have to duck, walls slanted in ways that made shadows fall at unnatural angles, low roofs that could suggest a dwelling built for beings smaller than an average human. There were sinkholes on the edges of courtyards, depressions that had swallowed entire doorways in quick recent soil collapses. The village had a solitary old man who prayed in the mosque all day. He was tolerant of outsiders, but would not spend the night. Villagers around the outskirts simply avoided the place. Cthulhu Clay described how his unit found water channels rerouted to keep animals out of certain courtyards, and how small piles of stones, arranged with a ritual slant, marked threshold spaces. Interpreters warned of curses. The old man, when asked, muttered about children of the sand and pointed to the holes. Architectural oddities don't prove any creature's existence, but they do provide context in which a soldier's perception could tilt toward a smaller scale of resident life. If buildings seem built for shorter occupants, if doors are too low and ledges too narrow, the mind fills gaps. Combine that with exhaustion, darkness, and the sound of talon-like clicks, and the human brain, which is excellent at pattern-making, may assemble an explanation that fits the sensory fragments, small humanoid things that move like quick rodents, but with a cadence like a person. D. Swoozy, the drill sergeant and the nibbled feet. There is an account from a drill sergeant, known as D. Swoozy, that veers into something more visceral. His story is not a tall tale told for effect. It was an uneasy, almost embarrassed confession from someone used to commanding respect. He described waking a recruit who had been sleeping with his boots off. The recruit complained of something nibbling his feet. Later, someone on watch glimpsed a small, pale shape crawling along a low stone wall, moving with a kind of stealth that felt deliberate. The sergeant's voice goes slow when recounting the sensation of waking to someone's cry and seeing an imprint of small teeth in the skin, nothing that amounted to a grievous wound, but enough to leave a distinct angry puncture mark and an itching for days afterward. The sight of the thing on the wall, thin, bent, the limbs folded at angles that suggested agility more than clumsiness, was enough to put the entire squad on edge for a week. A local folkloric parallel exists for this kind of attack. In many Middle Eastern traditions, there's a class of spirit sometimes called Palis in Western renderings, a vampiric jinn variant thought to feed through a person's extremities, especially the feet. That the term or the idea appears in interpreter stories is not surprising. Folk cultures often carry explanatory models for otherwise anomalous injuries. That doesn't prove the Palis exists as a discrete species. It does, however, explain why soldiers, who later hear the term, will fit their sensory memories to a culturally resonant narrative. Comprehensive Mixti 1. The Sand and the Small Sucker. A final account for this section comes from an Iraq deployment, credited to the handle Comprehensive Mix 931. This soldier reported seeing a small creature actively feeding on a comrade at the edge of a patrol base. When disturbed by a flashlight, the creature sank into the sand as if it were water, and disappeared beneath the granules. Later, the soldier whose foot had been bitten reported small punctures that itched and scabbed, and a neighbor swore he'd seen the creature slide under a clean patch of ground without leaving a drag mark. The image of a being that can melt into sand complicates physical explanations. No known common mammal dissolves into substrate, but there are natural conditions that can create the illusion of sinking, quicksand-like sinkholes, loose topsoil giving way, or the animal choosing to burrow into pre-existing holes. Additionally, insects and small arthropods can leave bites that appear as puncture marks, and nocturnal foragers, rodents, foxes, hedgehogs, can nibble at exposed toes. Again, none of that neatly accounts for the thermal and optical anomalies some soldiers reported, a thing visible to an immediate witness but invisible or indistinct on thermals. Cultural frames: Jinn, Palis, Redcap, and Swiss gnomes. Interpreters and villagers rarely use the language extraterrestrial or monster the way Western audiences might. Instead, they draw on named categories rooted in local lore. I want to briefly sketch some of those categories, with careful attribution. In many Islamic cultures, the jinn are a class of beings made, according to scripture and folklore, from smokeless fire. They are morally ambivalent in stories, some benign, some malevolent, and they are often credited with trickery, possession, and strange nocturnal behavior. Within that broad category, some local traditions describe vampiric types that feed through extremities. These are sometimes labeled in English as Palis, a borrowing that flattens a complex set of beliefs into a single catchy word. Across Europe, similar motifs arise. British folklore speaks of the Redcap, small, violent, goblin-like creatures who inhabit ruined castles and attack travellers. In Switzerland, the legends of Pleurs, also called Puro in nearby areas, describe small gnome-like beings associated with tunnels and landslides. Historically, the catastrophic 1618 landslide that devastated Pleurs Valley was later narrated with gnome tales attached, an example of how folklore can anchor to real events. These traditions are not identical, but they all share motifs relevant to soldier reports: small stature, nocturnal habits, a capacity to unsettle humans, and a meaningful relationship to particular places: thresholds, caves, sinkholes. Importantly, when locals bring these terms to soldiers, they are offering interpretative frames. Interpreters do not invent these labels at random. They inherit them from family lore, from communal memory. For soldiers, those labels can fill a gap, a word to hang on an otherwise inexplicable sensory experience. Patterns and repetition. If you put these stories side by side, certain elements repeat. Scale. They're small, often knee-height or lower. Movement. Fast, nimble, able to jump or bound with a human-like stomp at close range. Sound. A distinctive clicking, talon-like rhythm against mud or stone. Interaction with humans. Nibbling at feet, puncture wounds, brief close inspections. Evasion. Vanishing into sand, slipping into dark holes, eluding thermal optics. Local reaction. Interpreters and villagers treat certain zones as taboo. Ritual markers appear in courtyards and doorways. None of those details alone is decisive, but the recurrence across geography and different national forces makes the cluster harder to dismiss as mere hysteria. Cognitive scientists would point to shared environmental triggers, night, exhaustion, heightened threat, that push perceptual systems into similar modes. Folklorists would point to deep, transnational, little people motifs that turn up in disparate cultures. Field medics might note that small itchy punctures can be caused by a range of arthropods. A pragmatic intelligence officer might simply flag the reports as a metric of local population attitudes, avoidance zones that could hide IEDs or insurgent caches. On the ground, soldiers living the pattern react in several predictable ways. Some joke to deflect anxiety, others document it in unit logs and private forums. Some adopt practical precautions, keeping boots on, sleeping with socks and socks tucked, keeping lights on near sleeping areas. One veteran I spoke with said, "You learn to keep toes in boots because the unknown is worse than the known. You can prepare for a known threat." That line, "prepare for the known," gets at an important operational truth. Even a rumor can alter behavior in ways that matter tactically. Stress, sleep deprivation, and the brain's pattern making. It's important to put physiological context alongside folklore. Sleep deprivation is endemic in combat deployments. The human brain, when deprived of rest, becomes more prone to misperception. Visual acuity suffers, the threshold for false positives. The tendency to see a threat where none exists lowers. In plain English, exhausted people are likelier to mistake a rustle of fabric or the scuttle of a rodent for something more malign, because it's safer for survival to err on the side of assuming danger. But that explanation cannot account for everything. Multiple witnesses can report the same anomaly at different times in the same place. Interpreters whose cultural frameworks include certain beings sometimes refuse to enter areas. This is not fatigue-based, it is a cultural boundary. Instruments like thermal optics failing to register a clear signature. At the same time, a human witness describes a close encounter is odd if misidentification alone is the cause. And repeated stories across theaters, Afghanistan and Iraq, suggest more than a single unit's sleep-deprived imagination. Misidentified wildlife and environmental factors. We should also consider the fauna and terrain. Desert and semi-arid zones host a variety of small mammals and reptiles that are active at night. Foxes, genets, hedgehogs, sand vipers, rodents that will take advantage of toes left outside a sleeping bag. Nocturnal birds like owls can produce clicking calls that sound mechanical in the wrong ear. Burrowing animals can disappear into sand quickly, and loose topsoil can hide a creature in a matter of seconds. Environmental conditions can play optical tricks. Heat shimmer over sand can blur thermals and optical devices. Mud walls and low roofs can create acoustic echoes that amplify small noises into percussive sounds. Buildings with low windows and small openings, either intentionally built that way or degraded over time, create a perception that a place was designed for smaller occupants. The role of cultural contagion is also worth probing. Once a story exists, a whispered tale among interpreters or a shared message in a unit forum, the same sensory data will be filtered through that tale. A small noise becomes talons because talons fit the story. A narrow footprint becomes evidence of little men because the category exists in local lore. That is not to dismiss the witnesses. It is to point out that human perception is a conversation between environment and cultural narrative. Operational consequences. Avoidance and the unseen risk soldiers' reports of these creatures have operational consequences beyond the immediate creep factor. When interpreters refuse to enter a sector, patrols are constrained. When villagers place ritual objects at thresholds or mark certain courtyards, coalition forces must decide whether to respect local customs or treat that avoidance as a tactical gap. Units have evacuated sleeping positions for less. In some cases, the fear a community holds for a place might reflect real physical dangers, unstable ground, sinkholes, or the presence of enemy caches hidden in places locals don't want to touch. One veteran recounted a small anecdote that illustrates the ripple effect. A patrol had to bypass a village because interpreters refused to cross the main square. The squad adapted its route, but later discovered a shallow pit beneath the square, the kind of shallow, poorly visible hole that could conceal a pressure plate. The local taboo had, in practice, kept soldiers from stepping into a concealed hazard. The creatures, whether real or imagined, had shaped human behavior in a way that had a protective effect. Voices on the wire, anonymous forums, and the weight of many. It's worth acknowledging how these stories spread. Social media and veteran forums have become repositories for personal accounts. Handles such as Nunata, Cthulhu Clay, and Comprehensive Mix 931 are pseudonymous but consistent enough in their reporting to create threads that researchers and curious listeners can follow. That doesn't replace proper fieldwork or rigorous testimony, but it does create a living archive of recurring themes. These forums have their own etiquette. Veterans post cautiously. Exaggeration invites ridicule. Many who shared were reluctant to say their names on the record. The tone often shifts from bravado to a kind of weary sincerity when the storyteller crosses the line from funny anecdote to a memory that keeps them awake. That tonal shift is its own piece of evidence. These accounts are not always told to hoard attention. They are sometimes shared to make sense of an unresolved human experience. Tactile traces, scabs, punctures, and the medical record. Medically, reports of small punctures and subsequent itching deserve separate attention. Field medics treat insect bites, fungal infections, and small abrasions regularly. Many wounds that look like punctures are later explained by arthropod encounters or simple skin picking in sleep. Yet in some accounts the pattern is specific. Small, round punctures grouped on the foot, sometimes inflamed for days. These are the kinds of details that sent some soldiers to medics and then to unit logs. That said, medics rarely signed off on anything supernatural. Their notes are clinical: wound cleaned, tetanus checked, topical antibiotic applied. The medical record tends to flatten the strange into the manageable. For the soldier who felt something nibble at his toes, the medic's treatment can feel like dismissal. For the unit leader, the medical note is actionable. This difference between what a person remembers and what the ledger records creates friction in how these episodes are treated and archived. When local belief and military logic collide, interpreters, villagers, and soldiers approach these stories from different ontological angles. For an interpreter steeped in a tradition where the jinn are not metaphor, but part of lived cosmology, avoidance of a place may be as rational as avoiding the mouth of a river in flood season. For soldiers trained in tangible threats, that avoidance can be baffling. Bridging those frames requires not only cultural literacy, but also humility. For commanders, the useful question is often operational. Does the belief change behavior in ways that affect mission success or force protection? Often the answer is yes. Communities' beliefs shape the terrain of collaboration. In one patrol I studied, the simple act of village elders tying cloth to a gate signaled an area of taboo. Soldiers responded by rerouting. Rerouting means time, and time in a theater of operations is a resource. The creatures, named or unnamed, become variables that commanders must incorporate into planning. A human face in the dark. Across these accounts, what emerges most keenly is the human reaction: unease, amusement, irritation, and, sometimes, the long shadow of unresolved fear. A seasoned infantryman who has seen worse might still flinch when he hears a soft click too close to his ear. An interpreter who speaks the local language may simply refuse to go into a courtyard because their grandmother said so. Those responses are meaningful. They alter the way people move through a landscape, and they become data points that future units inherit. That thread, how human beings orient themselves toward unexplained phenomena, is one of the most instructive parts of this set of stories. It teaches us something about the limits of technology and the enduring weight of cultural memory. It shows how a single sensory incident, a sound, a bite, a glimpse, can ripple through an entire small ecology of human relationships. The night I sat on a rooftop. I have been careful to keep this in the realm of reporting, but after reading dozens of accounts and speaking with soldiers in quiet conversations, I found myself on a tour of a former patrol base in Helmand, with a veteran who wanted to point out where he had once stood watch. We climbed to a flat roof beneath a cold, wide sky. He mimed the footing, the parapet, the neighboring buildings. For a long moment, we just listened to wind moving over tattered canvas and remembered the particular loneliness of that watch. He told me about one night, doesn't matter whether he wanted to be named, and about a sound that had scratched across the top of a mud wall. The sound had no comfortable place in his operational lexicon. He had not been drunk, he had not been high, and he had spent too many nights awake to hallucinate a credible threat. He had felt watched. He had felt tiny and exposed in a way the work rarely asked of him. He also confessed that after his tour, he kept a flashlight next to his bed for a long time. He laughed when he said it, but his smile was thin. The image of a man with a flashlight on his nightstand is not cinematic. It is human. It shows how small moments change behavior. Where to from here? I've laid out a cluster of primary accounts and sketched the cultural frames that people use to name them. Djinn, Palace, Redcap, Gnomes of Pleurs. I've suggested physiological and environmental mechanisms, sleep loss, misidentification, animal behavior. That could account for many of the sensory details. I've also shown how these stories matter on the ground. They change routes, they mark avoidance zones, they cause soldiers to sleep with their boots on. But many questions remain. How do we reconcile thermal gaps with eyewitness certainty? Why do multiple accounts from different theaters return to similar motifs? To what degree does cultural language shape perception? And to what degree does perception shape cultural language? Those are the threads that pull at the seams of these stories. One evening after the rooftop conversation, I received a private message. The sender had served in a unit that had been in both Afghanistan and Iraq. His message was short. You should talk to him. He still has the scars. There was an attached photo, fuzzy, a close-up of a foot with several small-heeled circular marks. The image was not enough to prove anything. It was enough to make the story stranger. That photograph and the veteran who offered it led me to a small outpost on the edge of a town where an older interpreter refused to enter a courtyard. When I asked why, he shrugged and said, "My mother said this house is for small people. We do not go at night." He would not say more. His refusal felt absolute, not performative. It is easy from a distance to fold these anecdotes into one another and assign them to a category: myth, misperception, or phenomenon. It is harder and more useful to hold them together and watch where the seams bulge. To do that, we need witnesses, medical notes, unit logs, and the patience to compare what a man sees with what his instruments record and with what his culture teaches him to expect. On my last night in that border town, I climbed to a roof and sat with a veteran who had been on those patrols. We watched a sky the color of gunmetal and listened as the wind threaded through broken battlements. He touched the top of the parapet and said, "If something moves up there, I'll see it." We both knew what seeing meant in that context. Not just the eye, but the whole chain of evidence, from the thermal readout to the interpreter's tone. A sound moved along the top of the mud wall. It could have been a rat. It could have been the wind upsetting a bit of trash. It sounded to me like a small series of clicks. I raised my flashlight, not because I expected to find a creature, but because that is what humans do when the world narrows to a sound. We look. My beam washed over the uneven mud. Nothing but a scrawl of lizard tracks, a little scuttle of mice. When the beam swept past, the clicking stopped. We did not see anything else. We did not need to. The click was enough to make the hair at the back of your neck stand up, enough to remind you that some parts of a landscape remain unaccounted for, either because they are truly unknown or because we lack the right language to describe them. And so the question remains suspended, like the thin desert dusk. What are these small, fast things that soldiers report, and why do they recur? Some possibilities are mundane, some are cultural, and some are stubbornly resistant to neat classification. I keep returning to the same guideline: respect the witnesses, respect the cultural frameworks, and hold the mystery at arm's length. A man who had never told his story publicly offered to show me his scarred foot in person. Another interpreter walked away from a courtyard and would not explain why. The forum threads continued to accumulate handles and anecdotes, each fleshing out the night with one more click. I found myself arranging interviews and tracing locations, trying to map where stories cluster and where they diverge. Just before midnight on my last night in that theater, I sat alone on a low wall and thought about the pattern. Small, quick, talon-like sounds, nocturnal feeding or nibbling near feet, rapid disappearance into sand or holes, local rituals to mark places as taboo. It is the kind of pattern that begs for synthesis and resists tidy conclusion. Then, out of the dark, a thin noise ran along the top of the nearest mud wall, 3 precise clicks, and vanished. I turned my head, and in the absolute hush, realized that for all the explanations I was gathering, cultural, medical, environmental, there was still room in that hush for the unknown. That click along the mud wall, that little precise noise, hung in the air between us for a long beat. It felt, in that hush, like the story itself had condensed into a single element. Sound. There are nights when noise is just noise, and there are nights when one sound accumulates meaning. The way a grain of sand builds a dune. The accounts I've been tracing show how a handful of sensory cues, clicking, small stomps, brief bites, a body that disappears into substrate, can pile up and change behavior, culture, and even tactics. To press on from the rooftop moment, I followed those threads into other testimonies, into local law and into the practical consequences the reports produced. One pattern I circled back to was how often animals, dogs, and even children reacted to these places differently than soldiers did. Multiple soldiers noted that dogs would not enter certain courtyards. A shepherd would leave animals feeding at a distance. Children were told by elders not to play near a cluster of houses after dark. Those are small behavioral details, but they matter. Animals, being more tuned to scent and to subtle vibrations than humans, sometimes avoid things people still treat as ambiguous. A soldier can chalk a dog's skittishness up to stray behavior, but a shepherd who has watched his flock for 30 years will sometimes read that avoidance as serious. Such practical lived observation is where folklore and pragmatic caution meet. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with a medic, anonymous like so many voices in this story, who folded these episodes into the unit's ordinary injury reports. He had seen the photos of punctures and treated dozens of itchy little wounds over the course of deployments. He called them weird little bites, and his clinical demeanor never let him drift to myth. Most of the time, he said, it's arthropods or bacterial infection or someone rubbing at a scab in their sleep. He told me that sometimes a wound pattern would suggest an insect or a small mammal, and sometimes it wouldn't. The problem, he said, is context. A circular puncture on a toe is one thing when it appears in a pediatric clinic in a temperate town. It is another when it appears on a soldier who swears something was nibbling at his feet while he slept in a Baghdad patrol base. That ambiguity fed a particular kind of worry among enlisted men. If the official ledger can translate the strangeness into bug bite, the memory still lives in the marrow. Soldiers are trained to catalogue and reduce risk. When something resists cataloguing, they adapt and add rituals of their own. Keep boots on, keep socks tucked, turn on the light by the foot of the sleeping bag. These are practical, low-cost measures that reduce the unknown's leverage. They are also, in their small domesticity, a sign of how large the psychological effect can be. There are other tiny but telling traces. A corporal who'd served in both theatres told me about the smell that sometimes appeared at the edge of one compound. A metallic tang, like iron on the tongue. He didn't insist it was supernatural. He guessed at old blood, rusted pipes, or an animal carcass decomposing in the heat. But he also admitted that, the first time he noticed it, a knot formed in his stomach. Smell is a potent sense. It can tug memory quickly into fear the way sight alone often cannot. I kept returning to the forum threads where veterans shared their stories. There new details surfaced that didn't make it into official reports. A soldier who found a cluster of very narrow footprints in damp clay, another who described a pattern of small pebbles stacked on a lintel, a third who reported that his interpreter refused to cross an alley because the ground speaks wrong tonight. Taken separately, each post reads like the nightly miscellany of deployed life. Together they form a lattice of repeated signs, narrow footprints, small cairns, and the refusal of locals to occupy an otherwise serviceable room. Which brings me to Pleurs, a legend that travelled with me unexpectedly from Switzerland into the deserts of Afghanistan through the comparative work of folklorists. The tale of Pleurs, the gnome-like Puro, and the 1618 landslide that wiped out a valley was not a soldier's story, but it is instructive. In the Alpine tradition, small subterranean beings were said to live around tunnels and gullies. When the ground gave way, the narrative later stitched gnomes into explanations. The moral isn't that the Pleurs gnomes caused the landslide. The lesson is that folk narratives often map onto geophysical hazards in ways that anchor caution into daily speech. Where villagers in a small valley learn to fear certain hollows, elders in an Afghan hamlet learn to keep children away from a courtyard whose floor sinks in the rainy season. Folklore, in other words, can be a practical repository of environmental knowledge, sometimes accurate, sometimes symbolic, but rarely inert. There is, too, a European cousin to the small violent being motif, the red cap, a cap-wearing goblin of ruined keeps who dyes his hat with the blood of travelers. The red cap legend circulates in guidebooks and regional collections as a cautionary tale attached to particular ruined spaces. Again, the point is not to equate the British red cap with a soldier's account in Helmand. It is to show how human cultures supply explanatory shapes for similar phenomena. Ruined place, nighttime danger, small hostile presences. Those shapes travel across time and place because they help people reckon with risk in marginal spaces. If folklore supplies language, instruments supply another kind of evidence, and the mismatch between the two is one of the strangest recurring notes. Soldiers report seeing or hearing something up close that seems to an eyewitness wholly present, then checking thermal sights or night vision and finding nothing that matches. The physics here matters. Small animals have a high surface area to volume ratio. They lose heat quickly. An arthropod, or a small mammal that has been still for a while, may not present a strong thermal signature. Moreover, thermal optics can be foil to the miscalculation of emissivity, what object surfaces radiate and how. Mud brick holds heat differently from flesh. Moisture on stone creates odd readings. A skittish small animal that freezes for a beat might be visible as a tiny smear and then vanish. That momentary fragile signal, seen by a human eye in proximity but barely registering on instruments, seems to feed the uncanniness soldiers report. There are also psychological patterns that reliably produce similar stories. Sleep deprivation, as I've said, lowers perceptual thresholds. Besides that, groups living together in a sustained threat environment often develop shared narrative templates. Once a story exists, ambiguous stimuli elsewhere get folded into that template. In anthropology, this is sometimes called cultural contagion. An interpreter's warning about small men turns a quiet alley into a place to avoid. A unit forum post about talon-like clicking tunes the troops' ears to clicking sounds. That does not imply deliberate fabrication. It means human minds are wired to save cognitive energy by using existing categories. That same wiring, however, can make two observers at different times describe the same features in nearly the same language, which only stiffens the report's appearance of corroboration. But there are also instances that resist neat cognitive explanation. I'll return to the accounts where someone observed a small being feeding at a foot, and then, when lit with a flashlight or clubbed by a torch, the thing melts into sand and disappears without dragging a furrow. That description strains against common fauna behavior. It is possible, likely even, that the soldier misread a burrowing motion, or that loose topsoil swallowed the animal. Small rodents will dart into burrows, and loose substrate can appear to close over a body in seconds. Still, the vivid narrative of a being that dissolves into sand perpetuates because it fits into older tales of creatures that move between visible and invisible states. Again, culture supplies form where perception supplies data. What neither clinical medics nor skeptical analysts want to do is flatten the lived consequences. I asked a patrol leader whether the reports mattered in a way that impinged on mission. He gave me a short answer. Yes. He described a village whose center the locals avoided. In one sector, interpreters performing tasks under fire refused to enter a small compound. The unit respected that boundary not out of credulity, but because it would have been tactically unwise to force a space where the population was already signaling avoidance. That refusal can have beneficial consequences. The unit later found a shallow, camouflaged pit in the square, but it also leaves operational gaps. Avoidance maps can hide logistical choke points and create predictable routes that insurgents might exploit. So whether or not the little things exist as independent agents, the stories functionally alter the battlefield. I want to spend a moment on the voices themselves, people like Nunutta, D. Swoosie, Cthulhu Clay, Comprehensive Mix 931, and the Royal Marines interpreters. These handles are a kind of archivist shorthand, anonymous, sometimes jokey, often careful. The accounts that stuck with me were rarely the ones told with swagger. They were told with a softened, sometimes embarrassed seriousness. "I don't like telling this," a veteran would say. "It's dumb, but still." That hedging is important. It suggests that these stories are not just fodder for bravado, but rather personal, private puzzles that resist tidy frames. One striking moment came from an interpreter who would not cross a threshold because my grandmother said so. That phrase, simple and culturally dense, shows how knowledge passes across generations in ways that are pragmatic more than mystical. A grandmother's warning that a room is for small people might encode years of observation about unstable flooring, seasonal sinkholes, or dangerous animals. But because it comes wrapped in an animate cosmology, outsiders often misread it as superstition. Listening carefully to such warnings, however, can be operationally useful. As I triangulated these stories, the motif of feeding through feet recurred enough to prompt more focused inquiry. In some Near Eastern narratives, a vampiric jinn variant, sometimes rendered in English as palace, is said to drink through extremities. That is consonant with a number of soldier testimonies: bites to the toes and soles, subsequent itching, small circular lesions that scabbed. From a medical point of view, such lesions could be many things: arthropod bites, minor infections, contact with sharp vegetation, chronic dermatitis exacerbated by dirt. But in the narrative horizon of an interpreter's cosmology, the palace explanation neatly accounts for clustered punctures. Again, this is not proof, it is a discursive solution that helps people explain the otherwise inexplicable. I also want to push against a temptation. The temptation to treat all the reports as the same thing. They are not. A clicking on a parapet in Helmand is not identical to a creature observed burrowing into sand in an Iraqi patrol base. The reports cluster, yes, but they also diverge in the crucial details: habitat, behavior, physical traces. Part of responsible reporting is to honor those differences. It also means refusing the easy closure of a single hypothesis that explains them all. Toward a cautious synthesis, then, several plausible mechanisms likely account for most reports in whole or in part. First, misidentification of animals and environmental artifacts can and does occur, particularly when night, exhaustion, and threat narrow perception. Second, cultural frameworks shape how people label and interpret ambiguous stimuli. What a grandmother calls children of the sand may map onto animal activity or geological instability, but the label sticks and structures subsequent reports. Third, some accounts may include elements that do not currently fit conventional explanations: thermal gaps, rapid disappearance into substrate, and small puncture clusters that lack clear etiology. Those anomalies could be instrumentation quirks, artifacts of perception, or less likely but not impossible, something that does not yet fit our categories. What I refuse to do is settle on one answer, because the data refuses tidy closure. The more responsible posture is to triangulate, circle the phenomena from medical, folkloric, physiological, and operational vantage points, and hold the uncertainty as legitimate. That posture honors witnesses while avoiding the slide into ungrounded endorsement. In practical terms, soldiers adapted. They formed rituals to manage risk and anxiety. Leaders noted the operational effects and integrated them into planning. Interpreters maintained their cultural authority by signaling avoidance, and sometimes that avoidance had practical protective value. All of this matters because stories do not remain stories. They inform patterns of life and survival. There is also a human aftertaste to these narratives that is easy to miss in a technical analysis. When a veteran shows you a faded scar on his foot or admits he still keeps a light on at night, that admission speaks to what these experiences do to a person's interior landscape. A soldier trained to face human adversaries must also learn to live with the residual unease of nights where the enemy is undefined. Those residuals can be small: flashlight by the bed, or they can become a thread that pulls at memory for years. I went back to the rooftop on my last night and watched the way the sky closed to a thin band of light at the horizon. We listened, and an intermittent click moved along the wall. It could have been anything. It could have been nothing. The veteran I sat with shrugged and said, "You take it on its terms." That phrase, "take it on its terms," struck me as a useful rule for interpreting these encounters, treating the reports with curiosity, not ridicule, cataloging details, not discarding them, recognizing local knowledge as data rather than superstition. This approach yields the most rigorous insight. So where does that leave us, finally, with the title question, Strange Creatures That Soldiers Encountered in Combat Zones? The honest answer is, soldiers encountered something they could not easily name. Sometimes the something mapped onto known animals or environmental hazards. Sometimes it fit local folkloric categories that explained otherwise puzzling wounds or behaviors. Sometimes it registered as a sensory anomaly, clicking with no thermal signature, an apparent feeding with no clear perpetrator, that resists current explanation. Across accounts, a handful of motifs recur: small scale, rapid movement, sounds like talons or clicks, contact at the feet, and evasive disappearance into substrate. The convergence of those motifs across different theaters is enough to merit attention without warranting supernatural conclusion. If there is a practical takeaway for anyone heading into the dark, military or civilian, it is a modest one. Respect the local knowledge, keep your toes in your boots, and listen when a place feels wrong. Those are simple measures, and they are also a way of honoring a cultural ecology that has, in many places, learned the hard way which thresholds to cross and which to leave alone. Before I sign off, a final note. If you've heard something similar, if you've been on a rooftop and a click made you look twice, tell the story. Not every account will change the field, but each one contributes a pixel to a larger image. We don't need grand claims, we need careful accumulation and respect for witnesses. If you want to support long-form investigations like this, consider subscribing to the channel or becoming a member. Links are below in the description. Share the episode with someone who loves strange, responsibly told stories. Thank you for listening, and sleep with your boots on, at least until you've heard the ground's language for yourself. That lingering click I heard on the rooftop years later still returns to me in quiet moments. It is small, precise, and oddly intimate, a reminder that not everything that shares our space fits neatly into our words. Strange creatures encountered in combat zones may remain unnamed, but the acts they provoke, avoidance, ritual, cataloging, and curiosity, are as real as any patrol log. For now, the mystery stays open, and the best response is the oldest human one. Watch, record, and respect the places that make us uneasy.